Hello, my name's Ed Harris. I'm a playwright and poet, professional dyslexic and comedy writer and things like that. So this is an Arts Council funded research and development project for me to work on my first book for kids. And in this project, I've been able to work with a group of illustrators as well as an editor. And my mentor for this project has been the children's author, Will Mabbitt. Another thing that we did that I found incredibly useful was we worked with Varndine High School and Dorothy Stringer School with kids and classes of sort of various different ages from the sort of demographic, the sort of 10 to 12 that I'm writing this for, and older as well, which was incredibly useful.
Everyone had gone. The people who ran the shops, the people who ran the schools, the postmen, the publicans, the people with mobility scooters, the babies in prams and the people who pushed them, the fierce-faced men and women in suits who always walked like they were late for a train, people who drove vans with an arm out the window, the policemen, the grocers, old Craggy Bunsen, the pharmacist who worked in the chemists on the corner and always came out to give the girls a wave, the funky sax player who played Swedish blues.
So I've always wanted to write prose, and before I was a playwright, I was planning to become an author, because there's something about the intimacy of just that voice when you're reading it on your own. I'm dyslexic as well, and when I was a kid, my mum would often read to me sort of bedtime stories, but onto quite a later age than other kids might have experienced that. And a lot of my very fondest memories of childhood are being read stories, and so perhaps that's why I became a writer in the end anyway. For me, there's a beautiful intimacy about prose, and that's something that I've always wanted to explore. And also, I love writing for children. There's something so sort of sticky and marvellous and accepting when it comes to metaphor and ideas, and you can have big ridiculous ideas and kids go, yeah, of course, in a way that adults don't always sort of accept them quite so nicely. And it's a beautiful time to start asking questions about morality while kids are sort of interested in those large questions, and they don't feel that they've got them all sorted and nailed down like adults typically do.
When the thing that went floosh-flush arrived, it took a moment for the two witches to decipher exactly what it was they were seeing. Using a long pole as a punt, a sort of boatman pushed a raft through the pea-green waters. The sort of boatman's raft was made of train seats, lashed together with rope and wire. The seats were the neon orange colour of carrots after you've sicked them up after a bad casserole, and the kind of muddy, splodgy brown that looked like sewerage. The sort of boatman was terribly tall and slim like a candle, and creaked with every floosh and flush of his pole.
There are huge differences between writing for theatre and writing prose, and some of them are bleeding obvious, and I knew that they were coming, and I still managed to walk into them like a complete numpty in my planning. So word count, well, it's just huge. You know, a 45-minute play is about 7,500 words. That's one of the beautiful things about that, is that if you've got an idea and you want to try out a scene, you can just sit down and you can sort of hash out something in an afternoon that gives you a bit of an idea of what it is that you want to create. And then obviously drafts and drafts and drafts thereafter. If you've got a bit of an idea for a chapter, or you want to go down a little rabbit hole or explore a tangent when you're writing prose, it just takes time. In that same afternoon, you might be able to get down a couple of paragraphs or a few paragraphs or something like that. And so that stickiness of time, the fact that you can't sort of move very quickly through what you're creating, means that you need to plan and plot differently, and you have to be quite aware of what it is that you're going to be writing before you're writing it. So I found it was quite useful for me to sketch out my ideas beforehand, sometimes like literally in terms of drawings and doodles and things like that, sometimes in terms of bullet points, but also I found it very useful to walk with a dictaphone, and I'd go for walks up and down on the seafront and just talk into my dictaphone about, and try and get through the chapter, just sort of dictating to myself what's going to happen. And at least there'd be a lot of stuff that I'd have to lose from that, but at least I'd managed to, in a couple of hours, sort of walk clumsily through a chapter.
Bowls were handed out at a crazy pace, because scrambling in through the doors and windows like a little crowd of mountain goats came the children, shaggy-haired and short-haired with ponytails or braids, shaved close like kids with knits, or hanging in dreadlocks and swinging like ropes, with cheeky grins and suspicious glares, with grubby knees and black fingernails, with dirty hands and even dirtier grins, shouting and pushing and shoving and hollering, or whispering together in pairs. The children came thundering into the train carriage. They filled up every inch of every seat so that Tuppence and Camden found themselves squeezed together, with a child pressed tight against them at either side.
One of the things that attracted me to writing prose is the intimacy of that voice that you have. There's just one author and there's one reader, and in that experience it becomes something that, you know, when you're walking around and you've got your book in your back pocket and you sort of live with that character for a while and you live with that author and that way of seeing, and there's something about that intimacy that's always really, really appealed to me, and with that as well, obviously as a writer you have full control over everything that appears on the page. You can be as much of a sort of dictator as you want to be with it, and there's obviously pluses and minuses to working like that, because if you're working in theatre, you're essentially coming up with a sort of a recipe or a set of instructions for a team, for a whole ensemble to work with. And I think one of the beautiful things about that is that, or one of the ways that it saves a lot of time for the writer, and the writer gets to sit on his or her laurels quite nicely, is that if you've got a scene with a castle and a flying leopard in it, you only need to pop down in the stage directions that there's a castle and a flying leopard in it. And so it's somebody else's job to go off and work out what the castle looks like, somebody else's job to work out what the flying leopard looks like, how to manage that on stage, somebody else's job to curate whether the two things work together, and then a whole team makes the idea plausible on stage. Whereas if it's just you, then it really is just you, and you'll write a passage about your flying leopard or whatever it is, and realise that it just doesn't hold true. You don't buy it, and you don't know why necessarily until maybe you come at it a different way, or you leave it for a bit and come back to it. But there's something very freeing about writing scripts where that responsibility is shared amongst a team. And it also means when questions of sort of age appropriateness come up, if you're writing for kids and you have a scene where there's a man-eating duck with razor-sharp teeth that's chewing a young boy's leg off, if you're writing that for theatre, there are various different people that's going to go through before it hits the stage. And that might all happen behind a conveniently placed sofa, or it might happen with enough comic effect and the right sort of music to make the experience untraumatic. But of course, if you're working on it on your own, again, that curation of ideas and the curation of description and what's happening and what the image is that's going to appear in the reader's head is entirely down to you. And it means, again, that a lot of that responsibility just comes down to you. It's really tricky to come up with what my tips would be, because I feel, even though I've spent quite a while on this now, I still feel so green and naive to writing prose. Maybe that's one of the first things, is that I thought I'd just sort of land in prose land with lots of convenient skills and ready to go, because I've been writing for about 20 years. And some things were transferable, some skills are transferable, and other things really weren't. Dialogue does a completely different job in prose than it does on page for stage, because obviously if you're writing something for actors, you know that the dialogue that you're giving them, they're going to spend, hours really deciphering what it means and how to say it to communicate that meaning to people. Whereas if you're giving that same line of dialogue in prose to a reader, they're not going to spend hours on it. They're going to spend seconds on it, and what they're going to be looking for is useful information to help them through the story, which is possibly why often dialogue in prose is quite exposition-y and sometimes can be a little bit clunky, because it's really hard to write naturalistic dialogue that sits in prose, because its primary function isn't to convince the reader that this is naturalistic. The primary function is to move the story on.
When Camden woke up, everyone was gone. She looked under the tables and even behind the rocket-shaped silver fridge in the kitchen. She called into the back alleyway for the crystal ball. She ran in tiny circles outside the front of the Graceland, not knowing where to go but unable to stand still. She was just on the verge of exploding into a fireball of panic and tears and snot when she heard an "All right" from somewhere behind her, and Camden looked round and then up, and then up, and then further up, and then up again, and then up some more to see Tuppence clutching the crystal ball at her side like a goldfish she'd won at the fun fair, sitting on the shoulders of the Herbert 300.
Working with illustrators is obviously a kind of dream come true. I think if you're at all interested in writing for kids, you're fascinated. You know, we all grew up with Quentin Blake's drawings, and they're sort of imprinted on so many of our childhoods. It's really exciting, and just to see your ideas as another person sees them, that's something that we've always wished to do as writers.
So I worked with 4 illustrators and artists whose work I've admired for a very long time. There's Margot Holtman, who's a Dutch illustrator and artist, and her work is sort of incredibly detailed and sort of scratchy in a way that I find delectable. There's Lily Lemaire, whose work is sort of, while being also kind of swooshy and fluid, there's something kind of very woodcutty and maybe Eastern European and Slavic about it as well. Kit Bekar, whose illustrations are at once kind of tender and quiet, as well as a sort of, they kind of created an ominous, disquiet dreamscape at the same time. And Lucy Pepper, whose drawings are humorous and somehow very sort of solid, and you can feel the weight and the gravity of the characters, as well as the fun and the playfulness of the work.
So I think, well, at the moment, the first draft is with my mentor, Will Mabbitt. So I'm looking forward to hearing, well, terrified, but looking forward to hearing back from him about how that sounds and how it reads. And then I imagine I'm going to want to spend some more time on it, whether that's 6 weeks or 6 months, I've no idea, playing with it more before sending it off to publishers. And crossing my fingers and sweating desperately in the middle of the night. But I think I found this incredibly useful, and I think there's going to be a lot of things that I've learnt from this that I'll be able to take forward with me as a playwright, as well as next time I want to write something in prose form. I think I'm fascinated by the idea of working with an illustrator to create something from scratch now. So that's been a very useful door that sort of opened in my imagination. Some sort of collaboration would be fantastic. So I couldn't be happier or more grateful or more chuffed with this whole project, and so massive thank yous to the Arts Council for this. It's been career changing. I think it really has, and I just can't wait to find out, and I'm terrified, to find out how people find it as something to read, and then see what happens after that. I can't wait.